Hello everybody, Martin Radner here from Radner Law Group, bringing you trial analysis. Today we're going to be discussing the Austin Ford case. This is a case of the state of Georgia against Austin Ford. Before we do, please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you again for everyone who has subscribed already until this point and have been watching the videos. Please let's continue to help this channel grow so we can continue bringing you this trial analysis. So let's get into this case. So the Austin Ford case, this is a retrial because there was originally one trial already that occurred. And in that trial, there was a number of different charges, the most severe of which the jury was hung. So there was no verdict. There was declared a mistrial on the most serious of the charges. So he did get convicted already in the first trial of a number of charges, including tampering with evidence which carries a 1 to 3 year penalty in prison, theft by taking, which was 2 charges that he was convicted on, and each of those charges has a 1 to 5 years penalty of prison for those. And now what's left in this case is the home run charges, which is the felony murder charge, the aggravated assault charge, and the voluntary manslaughter charge, and the possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. So let's just first understand the different charges here. So we have the felony murder charge. Now, why is it called felony murder? Why are they bringing a felony murder case instead of a murder case? Well, maybe first let's just give a brief background about exactly what happened in this case. Essentially, there's a very young girl, Tory Lange, who was found dead. Was either a murder or a suicide, which is what this whole entire case hinges on. And the last person that she was seen with was Austin Ford, which was supposedly her friend. So she ends up dead. She was at her house. She was at his house before that. And that's the case. So we'll get much more into the details as we get along, but these are the charges that are brought against Austin Ford. So we have number one is felony murder. So they're not charging him with regular murder. And in Georgia, it's very interesting because in a lot of other jurisdictions, there's different degrees in murder. We all know first degree murder, second degree murder, third degree murder, manslaughter. We've heard about these terms, but in Georgia, there's felony murder and murder. There's no different degrees in murder. So murder is, as we all know, there requires an intent. It requires malice, a forethought, which means a person has to, plan it out, that he's going to go and premeditate and intend to commit this murder. That's the murder charge. When it comes to felony murder, though, the burden is much easier on the prosecution. And in felony murder under the Georgia statute, you don't need to have intent. You don't need the intent. In fact, just that you were committing a felony, and in the commission of that felony, you caused somebody else's death, so then you will be liable the same much as though you committed a regular murder. So felony murder doesn't have their intent requirement, and that's why it's much easier for the prosecution to prove their case, and that's why they're bringing in this case of felony murder instead of murder. So that's one of the charges, felony murder, and it has the same penalty, which is either death in Georgia, or life without parole in prison, or life with parole. So if they can get a conviction on the felony murder, that's what he's going to be facing. Now, the aggravated assault, is a intent, when you assault somebody with the intent to murder or rape or rob. That's one type of aggravated assault. There's also assault with a deadly weapon. So that's another part of it. So if he's found guilty of aggravated assault, so then that's going to carry a penalty of between 10 and 20 years in prison, and that's when it involves discharging a firearm. And when it does not involve the firearm, then he's going to be facing 5 to 20 years. So instead of 10 to 20 years, it would be 5 to 20 years if there was not a firearm. But here, there certainly was a firearm in this case. So then we get to the voluntary manslaughter, which is also a charge. That is when somebody murders somebody else as a result of sudden, violent, and irresistible passion. That's straight from the Georgia statute. So it's a result of sudden, violent, or irresistible passion resulting from a serious provocation. So the example in this case would be if they were in a fight. They were in a very bad fight, and maybe Tory Lange and Austin Ford were in a terrible fight, and he just pulled out a gun and shot her. That would be voluntary manslaughter, and that carries a penalty of 1 to 20 years in prison. Finally, we have the possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, which is just simply as it sounds. While you're committing a felony, you simply have the possession of a firearm on you, and that itself is a crime, and that carries a 5-year penalty in prison. So those are the charges that are left, and this is what they are retrying. Now let's talk about whether this is a case that the prosecution can win. Should they have, was there a good reason why the first jury was hung on these very serious charges? And is it really, by trying it again, are they going to actually, win the case? So first of all, as we know, juries can do anything. We have no idea what's going to happen with the jury. Everyone's scared of juries because juries are just unpredictable. You may think the jury's thinks like you, and really at the end of the day they don't. So, nobody knows what's going to happen with the jury, but let's just talk about the facts from a lawyer's perspective, and I'll tell you about what I see, the weaknesses and the strengths of each case from the prosecution and the defense. So, the prosecutor, he lays out the facts of this case. So he goes through the story, and as we always talk about, what the prosecution's job or the plaintiff's job in a civil case is to tell the story. You've got to tell the story about what happened to your client, and there's different ways to tell the story. Now, when it comes to a criminal case, generally speaking, what I like to see from prosecutors, and I think what I think is more effective, is if you tell the story from the defendant's point of view. You talk about the defendant. That's the story. The story is about how this defendant woke up one day and decided to commit this terrible, heinous crime, and he needs to be punished, and he needs to be put away the society needs to be protected from him. That is what I think is a stronger way of saying the story. So you always have two ways to say the story. You can either say the story from the victim's perspective. The victim woke up one day, she was doing fine, and she had breakfast, and then she went to visit her grandmother and things like that. Or you can talk about from the defendant's perspective. And I always think that in a criminal case, again, there's no rule that doesn't have exceptions, but generally speaking, I think it's stronger, and it's just when you're the prosecutor, to say the story from the defendant's point of view. What happened to the defendant in this case? What was his day like, and why did he end up committing this murder? And then, of course, you could talk about the victim also, ancillary to the main part of the story, which is the defendant's actions and his choices that he made that day. So that's something also I did not see in this case. The prosecutor said the story over from Tory Lange's perspective. He said that Tory Lange one day leaves her house at 10:30 at night, and she just doesn't come back. So her mother gets very nervous, and the mother actually calls her friend Austin Ford, who that's where she was going to. She calls Austin Ford to find out, hey, what's going on with Tori? Did you see her? Do you know where she is? Can you help me find her?
One of the people who Teresa reached out to was the defendant, Austin Ford. Austin told Teresa he hadn't seen Tori, didn't know where Tori was, but vowed that he'd look for her, and that if he heard anything, he'd let her know.
So the next morning, the story goes, this is how the prosecution says this, or the next morning, Theodore Young is a person who always takes a walk in this park, and he was walking through the park, and that's where he finds this dead body, Tory Lange's dead body. Then eventually, he calls the cops call the detectives, CSI gets involved, CSI responds to the scene, and something that the prosecution points out is that the only evidence that they find are the shell casings from the gun. That's the only evidence that they find.
The only physical evidence that CSI was able to locate was the two shell casings. They did not find any vehicle that appeared to be hers. They went so far as to have a police academy class basically canvass the entire area, lined up side by side, walked the entirety of the park, because as you'll see, it's ultimately a very large area. But they didn't find anything.
Now next, there is the medical examiner. And in this case, the medical examiner is a very significant part, and the prosecution really has to figure out what they're going to do with the medical examiner, because the medical examiner makes a number of determinations, a number of findings. So first, one of the first determinations the medical examiner makes, Dr. Terry is her name, so that Tory Lange was killed by one single gunshot to the head, and that the gun was 10 to 12 inches away from her head when that shot was fired. So it wasn't this, it was 10 to 12 inches away from her head.
What Dr. Terry will testify to is that she was killed by a single gunshot to the head that occurred from 10 to 12 inches away.
Now she also discovered, the medical examiner, that she was lying down, that Tory Lange was actually lying down when she was shot.
She determined that Tory was lying in the place that she was found when she was shot.
Now, what the most significant part that the medical examiner's finding is going to play in this case is that she could not determine whether this was a murder versus a suicide. She couldn't make that determination, and a lot of times the medical examiner can tell you that medical examiners, one of their jobs is to determine the cause and manner of death. What caused this person to die? Was it a gunshot or was it a heart attack? So they have to determine that. And then also what they have to determine is the manner of death. Was this an accident? Was this a suicide? Was this a murder? And here, in the manner of death, she could not determine whether this was a murder versus a suicide. And that's a very significant part.
So, because of what was there, what was not there, Dr. Terry was not able to make a determination about the manner of death. So the manner of death in this case is undetermined.
So now the prosecution has to figure out how are they going to take the wind out of the argument that the defense team is obviously going to make that, well, the medical examiner didn't even know herself whether this is a murder or suicide. So how are they going to deal with that argument? So, some prosecutors just ignore it and let, hopefully the jury will just buy my story. But which is always better to do, which I always talk about, is that to anticipate and dispel the other side's arguments during opening statement. That's very important. So that's what the prosecutor attempts to do here, and this is what he says.
But keep in mind, this ruling, this report, and this determination were made on the 29th of July.
So his theory is that, well, look, the autopsy happened right away after the shooting. They didn't have all this additional information and evidence that we discovered as the course of the investigation went on. So, yeah, at that point in time, the medical examiner couldn't determine whether this was a murder and suicide. But if she would have all the facts and all of the evidence that we already, got through our investigation, then certainly she would also realize that this was a murder and not a suicide. So that's one of the points that he makes. Now, he also brings it up again at the end of his opening statement about, that he brings up the medical examiner again and talks about how it was early on. But I think that first of all, you're going to see from the defense's opening statement, which we're going to get to soon, is that argument's just not going to fly, because the medical examiner is going to say, even as of April 2023, her opinion remains the same. And that was 2 years after she did this initial autopsy. So it's not a great argument that the prosecution has to say that, well, it was so early on and she didn't have all this additional information. I think that what would have been a little bit of a stronger point is that, the medical examiner has a job, and it certainly is a part of the case. And many times the medical examiner could determine whether this was a murder or a suicide. But you have to remember, the medical examiner is looking at a dead body, and she's seeing a gunshot wound. It's very hard from a medical examiner just to determine by one gunshot wound to the head that this is the murder or a suicide. You can't. She is only able to use the information in front of her, which is a dead corpse. And for looking at that dead corpse, it's very difficult to tell. Now, there are certain times that a medical examiner could tell that this was a murder, and there's certain times that they can't tell. And that has nothing to do with the ultimate determination that the jury is charged with, that we're charging you, the jury, with, is to determine whether this was a murder or not. The medical examiner can't always tell, and that's very normal, and it shouldn't bog you down so much at all. The medical examiner didn't make a determination. The medical examiner can't always make a determination. So that point, I think, should have been made stronger. And then if the jury would hear, okay, well, it's not like the medical examiner is the king of deciding whether this is a murder or not, and she's just the expert, and she's going to tell us, and if she doesn't tell us, then obviously we can't know either. And that's obviously what the defense is going to say. So as a prosecution, in order to dispel that, you say, look, she doesn't, it's not really it's not really always the case that she can tell. It's one gunshot wound, it's to the head, it's 10, 12 inches away. There's just no way scientifically to be able to determine, and given those facts, that whether this is a murder or a suicide. But jury, you're going to hear about all of the facts. You're going to hear about all the evidence that the medical examiner doesn't have to really take into consideration. She's just looking at the science. So that, I think, would have been a little bit better spin to the jury. Say, look, the medical examiner was what it was, and now we're going to bring you all this other evidence that tells you that this was actually a murder and it was done by Austin Ford. So I think that would have been a little bit of a stronger point by the prosecution if he would have said that. So let's move on in the story of the case. So the prosecution begins, and he says that, well, here's some information that Austin Ford's, the defendant's neighbor, had a Ring camera, and it picked up Tori coming to Austin's house at 10:40 the night before her murder, or the night before that she was found dead, and also leaving shortly after.
Now, one thing Corporal Smith did find before he turned the case over to Detective Carter was that where Austin Ford lived, his neighbor had a Ring camera. The Ring camera captured Tori coming over to Austin's house around 10:40 p.m. on July 27th. It later captured them leaving together shortly thereafter.
Now also, the Ring camera captured Austin coming home at 1:40 in the morning with different clothes on.
The Ring camera later catches the defendant coming home maybe about 1:40 in the morning wearing something different.
That's very significant. Different clothes on. Why is he changing clothing? He went out with one set of clothing at 10:40, and that was the night that Tori Lange was found dead, and then he comes home with different clothing. So that's the point that the prosecution is making. Very strong circumstantial evidence that Austin Ford actually committed this murder. Now, then he moves on to Austin Ford talking to the detectives. And he talks to the detectives, and he tells the detectives he denies ever being with Tori Lange that night. He denies the whole thing straight out. And that's also significant because it looks like he has, later on, this is going to be, that look, the evidence is clear that they were together, so why is he lying about it? Obviously, if you have something to hide, then you lie. So that is, again, another C that the prosecution is saying, Austin Ford, what's he lying to the cops about that she wasn't with Tori Lange? So he then continues the story, the prosecution continues the story. He says that he went to the funeral, again, allegedly he was a friend of hers. Supposedly he was a friend of hers, so he went to the funeral, but he didn't go to the vigil.
He went to her funeral, hugged her mother, knowing all the while exactly what had happened to Tori. I'll explain why. He did mysteriously skip the vigil that the family held shortly after Tori's murder at the park, at the location of her death.
Why wouldn't you go to the vigil? If this is your good friend that just got murdered or committed suicide, wouldn't you want to go to that vigil? You're so friendly with them. Shouldn't you go to that vigil? So prosecution's pointing out, when you're the one that caused that person's death and that was the scene where you shot that person, you might not be so comfortable going to that vigil. So that was another point he brought. Also, very strong point that remember, anytime we have a criminal case, there's always going to be geolocation data. Data that's picked up from your cell phone, where your cell phone was during the time of the murder or before or after. And he points out that Austin Ford's phone stopped sending signals at a certain time at night. That night, all of a sudden, stopped sending signals to the towers. Now, what's going on? And then all of a sudden, it picks up the signals back. All of a sudden, his phone starts sending signals again at 1 o'clock in the morning. So what happened from 10:40 or 11, whatever it was at night, that all of a sudden his phone stopped sending signals? Why? What did he do to his phone to stop sending signals? Oh, maybe he turned it off. Why? Maybe he knows that he knows about this geolocation data. He knows enough that it can track him. So therefore, he turned it off. And then at 1 a.m., he turned his phone back on after he was away from the scene. So that also is strong circumstantial evidence that Austin Ford was with her and he had something to hide. Again, part of this is that he had something to hide, because the defense is going to agree that Austin Ford was with her that night. So all this evidence saying, well, Austin Ford left together with her and he went together with her to the park, and then we can tell where he was. The defense is going to admit to that. And the only question is, well, while he was there, did she commit suicide or did he murder her? But when the prosecution points out about all this deception that Austin Ford is doing, all this lying, that suggests that he has something to hide. What's he hiding? If this was just a suicide of your good friend, then what are you hiding? What are you trying to turn your phone off for and not be tracked? So that's what, kind of what the prosecution is laying the seeds for in the jury's mind, to say this obviously, there's something nefarious going on over here. So he also points out, the prosecution, that he never called Tori. That night, Tori's mother, Teresa Lang, calls Austin and says, hey, where's Tori? I'm nervous for her. I'm worried about her. Where is she? And I thought maybe she's going to your house and you're such good friends. And what does Austin say? Yeah, sure, I'm going to help you. I don't know where she is, but I'm going to help you. Well, he doesn't call Tori. Why doesn't he call Tori's phone? If you're such a good friend, then you're nervous about your friend disappearing. When the first thing you do is call that phone, and maybe you'd call it 100 times. He didn't call it once.
The fact that he did not call Tori after she was killed, his supposed best friend, his alleged friend, who is lying dead in Yellow River Park, who has told her mother, I'm going to help you look for her, I'm going to help find her. But he doesn't call her, not one time. Not because he knew about recording of the cell phone number and where Tori's phone actually was, but because he knew she wasn't going to answer.
So that's also a point that the prosecution makes out, that, again, this looks like there's something nefarious going on over here, that Austin knew Tori's not going to answer. Tori's dead. So that's another point. He also then talks about the detective interrogating him again. And he talks about the first time, he lied. Austin just lied, denied everything. And then later, then the detective says, look, we got all this evidence showing that you guys were together. You can't deny that you were with her. So then, all of a sudden, Austin's story changes. And Austin says, yes, I was with her. She came over to my house, but she was suicidal, and that eventually led to her shooting herself.
The defendant now changes his story. What he tells Detective Carter is that he was with Tori the night of the 27th. That she came to his house despondent and suicidal. That they went to Yellow River Park and he saw that she had her mother's gun. He says they talked in the park, that she told him she was going to hurt herself, that he took the gun from her, placed it on the ground, gave her a hug, that she pushed him away, grabbed the gun, and shot herself in the head.
Now, what did he do because of that? So he says that he was so scared because she just shot herself, so he decided to take her gun. This is his story. This is how the prosecution's laying out his story. So he was so scared that he decided to take her gun and throw it in the pond. Throw the gun in the pond, for some reason. He's scared. And he says, the prosecution says, we sent divers down into the pond and couldn't find that gun. Okay. And then he also disposes of the car. Drove the car to some area. And again, this is all because I guess he's just in a state of shock. He doesn't know what to do, so he just takes her gun and throws it in the pond and drives the car away. So prosecution is saying, look, that just doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that if this was a suicide? Even if you're in shock, what are you going to do? Throw the gun away and drive her car away? Why? Well, what's the point of that? And I'm sure he'll make a stronger point about this in closing arguments. Then he talks about the medical examiner, and again, and one of the ways that he's dispelling the medical examiner's, that the medical examiner was undetermined, that her finding was that it was undetermined whether this is a murder or suicide. Well, he says it's just far-fetched. Think about it. Use your common sense. I don't know if he said use your common sense, but he said it's just far-fetched. It's far-fetched to think that someone's committing suicide and they're holding the gun, 10 to 12 inches away from their head. If somebody wanted to commit suicide, don't you think they would put the gun right next to their head? How would they do that? They might miss. So, again, this is a good point, that even though the medical examiner is saying, look, according to the science, I can't determine whether this was a murder or a suicide, but now the prosecution is saying, look, just use your common sense. Would anybody commit suicide that way? It doesn't make any sense.
The notion that Tori picked up a gun off the ground and shot herself in the side of the head 10 to 12 inches away in such a way that it severed her brainstem, which would have stopped her movement, functioning, heartbeat, breathing, it's almost instantly, while laying down, is far-fetched.
And that's a very strong point also. I think that's a good point that he made. And yeah, it is a little far-fetched to think that that's how someone would commit suicide. Now, he also talks about reasonable doubt, which I always like when the prosecution embraces the burden of proof and not shies away from the burden of proof. As a prosecutor, it's a very high burden, beyond a reasonable doubt. And you've got to embrace that and tell the jury, look, we understand that there is a very high burden here, and we appreciate that. That's the society that we want to live in. In this case, it just so happens to be that it's so clear that this person committed the crime that there is no reasonable doubt. And you also want to say, okay, it's not beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's not like there's, some miracle could have happened and something crazy would have happened. That's not normal. I mean, that's not the type of doubt it is. It's more of a reasonable doubt. Is that something that's reasonable for a person? So yeah, you try to kind of make it a little bit easier, but also embrace it and say, yeah, but the evidence in this case is so strong, and that's something that he does do. Now, then what's the defense's argument? So the defense, their arguments are that number one, facts should be your guiding feature in this in this trial. Meaning, don't let your feelings get involved. This is what he starts off with. Don't let your feelings get involved in this case.
Evidence is facts, not feelings.
And that's a good point. That's a very good point, because someone's dead, and she is very young. She's very young, and she just died. So that is a very good point to say, look, we were very, and he could have embellished this a little bit more. He could have said, look, we're all very sad here. This is not a happy ending. Tory Lange's life, this is not a happy ending, and it's a terrible tragedy what happened. But don't let that feeling make you want to convict somebody that's not based on the facts and the evidence. This is a case. This is this evidence is what this case should be based on, is evidence and facts. So don't let the feelings just carry you away. So that's the first point that he makes, which is a very good and strong point. And then of course he talks about the medical examiner, and he completely takes the wind out of the prosecution's initial argument about the medical examiner, which is that, the medical examiner only did the autopsy a day or two after the person was dead. Well, that's what always happens. I mean, he could have said this. Well, that always happens. It always happens that the autopsy is done right away. They don't wait 2 years to perform the autopsy. All medical examiners in all cases, they do the autopsy right away. And he points out that even as of April 2023, it was still undetermined. The medical examiner stuck by her gun, saying that it's undetermined whether this was a murder or suicide.
The medical examiner makes a determination on July 29th, 2021. I cannot tell, based on the science, whether it was a suicide or a homicide. Well, she made that determination back on July 29th. She sticks by that very determination April of 2023.
So, very strong point that that you can't buy the prosecution's story. And he also, talks about how experienced Dr. Terry is. Dr. Terry, the medical examiner, she's done autopsies since 1990, has performed over 6,000 autopsies in many cases, and has found in many of these cases that there was murders, and was able to determine the manner of death. In this case, she could not. So that's going to be what the defense hangs their hat on during this case. she's very experienced, and she couldn't determine. So that's a very strong point. Then also, which is also some strong points for the defendant's side, is that Tory Lange actually brought the gun. This gun was Teresa Lange's gun that she was murdered by or shot herself by. So you ask yourself on the jury, if this was a murder, you think the murderer would ask the victim to bring a gun? Does that make any sense? The murderer would go get a gun. That's how you murder somebody. You get a gun, you sneak up on the person, or you convince the person to go with you somewhere, and then you shoot him. You don't tell the victim, oh, by the way, bring a gun because, maybe it's a good idea to have a gun there. And then you steal their gun and shoot them with their own gun. That doesn't make any sense. So this gun was Teresa Lange's, which is Tory's mother's gun. Tory brought that gun with her. So what was going on over there? I mean, this doesn't sound like it's a murder.
Tory Lange brings the gun and then shoots herself. There's no contradiction to that.
Also, she was lying down. The medical examiner did determine that she was lying down when she was killed. Who murders someone like that? You think he put her by gunpoint and said, now lie down, okay, lie down, I'm going to put this gun next to your head on the side and shoot you? That doesn't make any sense.
The science is undisputed that Tory Lange lies down, face up when the bullet pierces her head.
So that also is a very part. Now he says, well, maybe this was an assisted suicide, because I guess that's what he's anticipating, that perhaps the prosecution is going to turn this into. Well, even if Austin Ford assisted in her suicide, that's illegal and that's a felony, and now you caused somebody else's death. So now you're a felony murderer, and now you get life in prison without parole. So so he also says like this. That also doesn't make any sense to say that it's an assisted suicide. There's just no evidence for that. So he says, please, just use your common sense. What he also stresses, the defense, is that use your common sense in this case.
The judge will tell you at the end of trial, we got to look at the facts. You got to put your common sense with the facts. And when you put your common sense with the facts, the only just verdict in this case is going to be a not guilty on all the charges.
Person's lying down. Who murders someone like that? Somebody brings their own gun and then gets murdered with their own gun. That doesn't make any sense. So, and again, you have the medical examiner saying that she can't determine it. So these are very strong points for the defense's side. Who lies down like that? I think that's a very strong question. Who lies down when they get shot? You think that he made her lie down, or maybe, you could say, well, maybe, he convinced her, they were friends, right? I guess maybe he was pretending to be a friend, or maybe they fell out or something, and they were lying down in the park together. Maybe they're just lying down, and then he just convinced her to bring her gun somehow, and then took the gun and shot her. So, there's are significant questions that the jury's going to have to deal with to be able to come to a guilty verdict. I mean, really, there's some very strong defenses here. Now, again, there are some strong points of what's all this lying for. All these, Austin's story doesn't make a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, you've got to have the evidence to convict Austin, and there can't be a reasonable doubt. And there certainly could be reasonable doubt in this case, just based on some of the facts and some of the arguments that the defendant made. So we will see what the jury does with this case. Again, there are some very strong points for the prosecution side, but again, there are some defenses, certainly some strong defenses here also, and we will see what the jury decides. Maybe they already decided before this video came out. So anyway, thanks for everybody for watching. Please like and subscribe to this channel, and we will see you next time.